Hello, everybody. We are going to go ahead and do for today, as it's coming near the end of February. We're still trying to move along with some of these presidents, trying to get up to Abraham Lincoln before St. Patrick's Day is the goal, and then we're going to take a break once we cover him. So, just before February ends, we got at least a couple more that I'm going to try to get into and cover before that happens. I think we're going to be able to cover 3 more. I plan on doing at least 2 next week, maybe 3 if I can get to it. So that would get us pretty much up to Lincoln after this point. So for today, we are covering the 12th President of the United States. In the last video, we covered the 11th President of the United States. We covered James Polk. So today, we are going to cover the 12th President as we flip through the magical little cards here. I hate when these things never stay, just they don't want to slide back in place easily. Alright, so today we are covering the 12th President, Zachary Taylor. Another president that's probably not very well known. In fact, if you really think about it, I don't think anyone really knows any of these presidents because they're kind of stuck in the middle of the 19th century and no one really bothers to study the 19th century. And the common people, like a couple presidents, you'll know probably the ones on Mount Rushmore. At least I hope you do. Everyone knows who George Washington is. Everyone knows who Abraham Lincoln is. Most people know who Thomas Jefferson is, although I will say I've met a few that do not. And most people know, like, the more recent presidents or whoever's the current president. Of course, you should know that. But these presidents are not really ones that people hear about whole lot. So we're going to be kind of go through uncharted ground for these few up to Lincoln, are very much unknowns in today's society. So again, we're covering Zachary Taylor, who was our 12th president from 1849 till 1850, which you can surmise that a president is supposed to serve 4 years, so I can inform you right now, yes, this one died in office too. He is our second president to die in office. So we're going to go ahead here and just start up right away with covering what we need to get covered. So for starters, Zachary Taylor was born on November 24th of 1784 in Orange County, Virginia. He was raised on a tobacco plantation owned by his father Richard near Louisville, Kentucky, which they moved to Kentucky shortly after Taylor was born. So he was born in Virginia, but he grew up mostly in Kentucky. His parents moved shortly there, and after, of course, his birth, and he received a very rudimentary and simple education. Taylor actually never really went to school. Everything that he knew of an education was either what his parents had little time to teach him or he had taught himself. He really was not that well educated because they were a poor family. They couldn't even, back then, there wasn't public schools like there is now. Back then, it's more if you had the money to afford to send your child to school for an education or for a private tutor, you could send them there. Well, the Taylor family was not really rich at all, and because of that, they couldn't afford to send Zachary there. So Zachary was not very well educated, but he tried to educate himself when possible. His parents taught him skills that were useful for the frontier, like horsemanship and farming, which were much needed in that time. Kentucky was the frontier at that time. And he also learned how to use a musket from a very young age. Now, in 1808, Taylor ends up leaving his family home near Louisville in Kentucky after he receives a commission as a first lieutenant of the U.S. Army. He decides that he wants to go make a career in the military because he's not a really educated man, so he's like, okay, I can't be a lawyer. I don't want to be a politician. I can't be a banker. I can't be a merchant salesman. I'm just not into that. So Taylor comes to the conclusion that I'm a simple man of simple means. I will join the military. They're not discriminatory towards simple men and simple means. They just need people that are willing to fight. So in 1808, he leaves Kentucky to join the U.S. Army. And a year later, he ends up marrying Margaret Mackle Smith, who he marries. that year and is his wife until his death in 1850. They end up having 6 children, and 2 of these children are somewhat significant. The first, one of their daughters, Sarah, she ends up marrying Jefferson Davis in 1835. Now, if any of you are Civil War buffs out there, you may realize that Jefferson Davis was the future president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And for a period of 3 months, she was married to this man. Unfortunately for Sarah, she ended up dying about 3 months into the marriage. And it broke both Zachary and Margaret's heart as well as Jefferson Davis's. And they also, out of their many sons, they had their son named Richard. Richard would later become a Confederate general during the Civil War. Now, Zachary and Taylor, well, not, oh my goodness, I am going to mess up so much of today. Zachary and Margaret end up settling near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And this actually doesn't happen until 1822, but shortly after their marriage, they start taking vacations down to Louisiana as they just begin to love the land down there and they dream of having a plantation or home to own down there that they could live at. And eventually, by 1822, they end up mostly living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, while maintaining a smaller home up in Kentucky. And they own about a 2,000-acre plantation, eventually end up owning 2,000 acres down in Louisiana on this plantation of his, and about 80 slaves. Yes, Taylor was a slaveholder. It was the second plantation that he had. He had a small home in Kentucky, as we mentioned. He has the plantation down in Louisiana, and eventually Taylor gets a second plantation up in Mississippi. So he literally owns 3 properties across 3 different states, eventually. Now, during the start of his military career, he ends up serving in the West, or the Northwest as we would call it now, the Midwest, actually. So, like Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. And he ends up serving in this area, Missouri, even. And during the War of 1812, he serves in the war as a army officer during the War of 1812. He ends up being given command of a small frontier fort where he actually defends it against the attacks of Native Americans led by Tecumseh in September of 1812. He commands Fort Harrison, is what it was called, after Major General William Henry Harrison, who was a major general at that time and later a future president. By the end of the War of 1812, Taylor gets promoted to the rank of major, and he holds this role in the army for the next decade or so, throughout the 1820s and the 1810s. And then when the Black Hawk War breaks out in Illinois in 1832, due to the reservations of a Native American tribe under Chief Black Hawk in Illinois, that they were trying to push them onto a reservation. He did not want to be pushed onto a reservation and began to combat the government and local settlers. Taylor ends up commanding troops there under the rank of colonel. So he's granted this rank during that time. Now, what happens shortly after is Taylor continues his military career by going to Florida. He gains the premise of an Indian fighter. He fought the Indians in the War of 1812. He fought them in the Black Hawk War. And now he is sent down to Florida between 1837 and 1840 to combat the Seminole Indians, who are at war with the United States Army as the Seminoles are trying to be pushed out west to Oklahoma, or Indian Territory as it was called at the time. And Taylor is one of the army colonels that they send down there to try to help the army push the Seminole out. Now, ultimately, the army fails in this objective. Many of the Seminole actually flee into the Everglades and go into hiding, and the army is not used to the Everglades. It doesn't know how to navigate them. It gets lost in them. There's so much vegetation that to the Native Americans, to the Seminole, this is their natural environment. They know every crook and cranny and swamp in the Everglades. They know where to hide. They know where they can ambush United States Army convoys and everything at. So the Seminole basically escape into the Everglades, and eventually the army gives up looking for them and just says, you know what, as long as they stay in the Everglades, there ain't going to be none of us that are going to go in there and settle it, so let them have the Everglades, as long as they stay out of the rest of Florida, because we want all that for ourselves. So eventually the army gives up on trying to push the Seminole out of Florida, and the remaining ones kind of hide out in the Everglades. But Taylor was given command during that Second Seminole War in Florida. And by the end of it, he ends up being promoted to brigadier general due to a victorious battle that he won at the Battle of Okeechobee, or however they pronounce it. I do apologize. Now, shortly after getting that rank during the Seminole War, Taylor also gets the command of all American troops in Florida between 1838 and 1841. And by this time, he starts to become interested in politics for really the first point in his life. Taylor was never really a big political man, and he really didn't hold political views until the early 1840s. But he was very private about it. He would not go out publicly and did not tell the world what his political views were. It was something he discussed in a close matter of family and close friends. He was not someone that would just start blurting things out. And during his time in Florida, he also gained the reputation of his nickname called Old Rough and Ready, as he was constantly, not like other commanders where they would kind of give their soldiers orders and then sit back and let them do all the hard work. Taylor was different. Taylor would actually get down and do the dirty work with his men. He would march with them. He'd go and when they were shooting at the Native Americans came under fire, he'd be right there shooting with them. He was not the commander that would sit back and let just watch as the others did whatever he commanded them to. He would give commands, yes, but at the same time he took part in the same commands with his troops, with his men. Now, in the 1840s, as we get to the mid 1840s, tensions begin to rise, as we know, between the United States and Mexico over the issue of Texas. As we recall, Texas is wanting annexation by the United States, and Mexico has never really formally recognized Texan independence and claims that it's still technically Mexican territory. Now, as the tensions rack up in the mid 1840s, Taylor ends up being placed in command of Fort Jessup in Louisiana to guard against any Mexican attempts to reclaim Texas in 1844, because there's the big fear that, well, Mexico will just invade Texas before we can annex them, so that they can't be annexed. And the president kind of instructs that you are going to be put out to this fort in Louisiana, and if you see the Mexicans trying to attack the Texans, you would help intervene on their behalf. This was ordered by President Tyler. Now, after 1845, President James Polk is now in power. He has gained the office of president through election, and he attempts to negotiate with Mexico to kind of hand over this boundary for Texas. He's willing to buy California and New Mexico, as we covered in the last video, and Mexico is just not having it. Mexico has no intention of giving away those territories, of even acknowledging that Texas is independent, even though it's been annexed by the United States at this point. And this kind of ticks off Polk. Polk was insistent during his campaign that he would get these territories, and here's Mexico just blatantly defying him. And how dare they? I'm the president of the United States. I'm more powerful than they are. The United States is more powerful than they are. Why would they dare defy me? Polk took this to heart. He took this as an insult to him, and he uses Taylor and his troops as a provocation to get Mexico to start a war that he could then blame on Mexico, even though in reality it was kind of Polk's fault in the first place. He orders in February of 1846 for Taylor and his men to march down to the Rio Grande River, which the Texans and the United States declared was the southern boundary of Texas, although Mexico claimed it was further north at the Nueces. And he wants them to march down, secure that as our border, and basically have a troop presence there. Knowing good and well, the Mexicans do not recognize that as the Texan border. Well, Taylor and the men go down there in March of 1846. They come in contact with Mexican troops who request that they leave, that they are on Mexican territory. Taylor and his troops refuse the offer, and in return, the Mexicans open fire on Taylor and his men. Now, Taylor and his men, they get out alive, most of them, and they retreat back to Texas briefly, and they end up. This gives President Polk the excuse that he needed to declare war on Mexico. And many members of Congress saw through this, and they chastised Polk, at least on the Whig side, because Polk was a Democrat. But other than the Whigs, most of the country wants war. The North sees it as an opportunity for expansion, while the South also sees it as an opportunity to expand slavery. Now, as the Mexican War begins, Taylor remains in Texas. He's kept in Texas. He ends up winning the battle at Palo Alto and I'm trying to say this right. Resaca de la Palma. which forced the Mexicans back across the Rio Grande River. They're out of Texas finally by mid 1846. And this happens by May. By May, he is promoted with the rank of Major General, which is given to him by Congress, bestowed to him, and he's commended by Congress. He ends up caring for part of the reason that Congress commended him was because when Taylor would take Mexican prisoners in these battles, he did not treat them harshly. In fact, if any Mexican prisoners were injured, he gave them the same amount of care and medical attention that he would give to his own American soldiers. And this earned him a high respect from the Mexicans that he was engaging with, but at the same time gave him a congressional commendation for his actions. Let's see here. Now, because of his successes against the Mexicans and pushing them out of Texas, Taylor starts to grow in popularity at home, and some start suggesting that, hey, he could run for political office. He'd be an excellent candidate. Taylor, at the time, had claimed to have no ambition for political office. In the succeeding months, Taylor ends up winning the Battle of Monterey in September in Mexico itself, which opens the path up to Mexico City for the U.S. Army. However, by this point, some of his political views start getting out to President Polk, who starts to see that Taylor is starting to align with the Whigs a little bit. And this is the opposite of his political party. So he tries to tell Taylor, okay, you're going to stay at Monterey, trying to punish him basically because he don't want a potential Whig Army candidate getting all the credit for the war. And he orders Taylor, okay, I want you to stay at Monterey. Doesn't really tell him why, just says, I just want you to stay. When in reality, it was kind of a punishment for his political views. Taylor just obeys this order, and he moves south. And by early 1847, he wins the Battle of Buena Vista and returns home to Louisiana in December after winning this battle, as he decides to end his tenure in Mexico as other generals start taking Mexico City and Veracruz, and the war is almost over. So he deems, okay, I'm not really much needed anymore, and the presidents obviously start not to like me because now I also disobeyed his orders, so I'm just going to call it quits now. So by December, he leaves the army and goes back home to Louisiana. Now, upon reaching home, this is when Taylor's political career starts to somewhat kick off. Taylor, again, he was never very public about his political views. It was something very private to him. However, out of his political views, he aligned with the Whig Party. He believed in a strong banking system and thought that Andrew Jackson's decision to end the funding of the charter for the Second National Bank back in the 1830s had been a grave mistake, which was a key product of Whig political ideology and basically a insult to the Democrats who had been the party of Jackson. He also believed that it was impractical to expand slavery west, even though he was a slaveholder, because he viewed that slavery was basically a trouble issue. And although he very much had slaves and owned them himself, at the same time he didn't want to expand because he saw it would cause more problems nationally than it would solve. And he also argued it's impractical to send slaves out there because the soil out west in Arizona and New Mexico and even Southern California is not ideally suited for growing cotton or sugarcane, but the main products of the main cash crops that slaves were being used to grow. So he argued, why would we need slaves out there? And he was also against secession, which had been suggested by some southern states as they grew angry with the North. And this was because he was a firm nationalist. Being in the army had kind of transformed him into a very big nationalist figure. Now, by 1847, Taylor starts to formally align himself with the Whigs publicly, but he still refuses to entertain a presidential run. Even though he is popular in both North and South, and could replicate William Henry Harrison's performance because he's a military man. Part of the reason Harrison won was because he was a very well-known military general. Taylor has the exact same potential here in 1848. Eventually, many of the Whig Party leaders keep trying to convince Taylor to accept the presidential nomination from the Whigs. Run for us as our presidential candidate, and you'll win. And in 1848, Taylor finally becomes convinced to run for the Whigs after much intensive lobbying is done to change his mind. And he defeats Henry Clay and Winfield Scott for the party's presidential nomination that year. His vice presidential running mate is selected by the Whigs as New York Whig Millard Fillmore, who was a very popular member of the Whig Party at that time from New York. Now, Fillmore was partly selected to appease the Northern Whigs, but it really did little to appease the South in general. And this was because Taylor being a slaveholder meant that the growing abolitionist movement in the North to end slavery really was not very supportive of Taylor as a presidential candidate because he owned slaves. So Fillmore's added onto the ticket as a guy from New York who does not own slaves and is a Northerner to kind of balance that out. He'll appeal to the Northerners as Taylor will appeal to the Southerners. Now, Taylor, during the campaign, he was kind of odd. He let his campaign aides and Fillmore kind of run the campaign. Even though he was the main candidate, he largely did not take an active role in the election campaign. He didn't go out and do speeches to the voters. He didn't go out and meet with them. He didn't go out and do fundraising events or anything. He largely left the running of his entire campaign to his advisors and to Fillmore. And part of the reason that Taylor ends up winning is because the Democrats become divided in the 1848 election that year, because President Polk said he is not running again. He was only going to serve one term, and then he would be done. And the Democrats become divided when Martin Van Buren, the former 8th president, decides that he's going to run on a third-party platform called the Free Soilers, who are a very anti-slavery party. This splits the Democratic vote, as some of them go with Van Buren, while other Democrats still vote Democrat, but it splits that Democratic base stronghold of the votes, especially in the critical state of New York. The Democrats end up nominating a man by the name of Lewis Cass. The election results in 1848 were as follows. For the popular vote, Taylor won 47.3% compared to 42.5% for Democrat Lewis Cass and only 10.1% for Van Buren. In the electoral votes, Taylor won the election with 163 electoral votes. Cass took 127, and Van Buren got 0. And in terms of states, both Cass and Taylor took 15 states each, with Van Buren getting 0, but he did successfully steal enough votes away from Democrat candidate Lewis Cass in New York to sway that election to Taylor. Right. Sorry for the brief little pause there. So that gets us up to Taylor's presidency. He gets elected in the election of 1848. Now, before we proceed, let's see here. Here is a small portrait of Margaret Taylor, Zachary Taylor's wife and future First Lady, as she was. They had 6 children together, and they were married until his death. We have a portrait of Zachary Taylor, a picture that was actually taken of him during his time as a general in the Mexican War, back during about 1846. And then here we have the electoral map of the 1848 election. All the blue states were ones that not Taylor, but Cass took, and all of the yellow were ones that Taylor took as the Whig candidate. And so that gets us up to his presidency. As always, back in the old days, the presidents were not inaugurated on January 20th. The original inauguration date was set on March 4th. So back during the 19th century, this was still the case. This was not changed until the first president to have an inauguration on January 20th was Franklin Roosevelt. So that was the 1930s. So what ends up happening, of course, Taylor starts his presidency on March 4th of 1849 after getting elected the previous fall. During his brief time as president, he really doesn't have a whole lot time to do much just due to how brief his presidency was, but he accomplishes at least a couple of things. Firstly, he starts to do vocal support from the United States government for the ongoing liberal revolutions that are occurring in Europe, especially in Hungary and the German states. as during the previous year in 1848, liberal revolutions had broken out in many European nations, and this was kind of a result of rejection of absolute monarchialism that had kind of pervaded Europe for the previous couple centuries and was still somewhat present in Europe by 1848. So there was a high demand by the common people to put an end to monarchy, and they wanted a change to their governments. They either wanted a more democratic society, like a constitutional monarchy, or they wanted to abolish the monarchy altogether and create an entirely democratic government. Many of these ended up failing, and in the case of Germany and Hungary, Germany's completely failed at the time, but Hungary's did accomplish in getting a wider knowledge of the Hungarian people's plight to the Austrian Empire, which kind of ruled them at the time, and it eventually convinced the Austrians to give the Hungarians their own parliament and allow them to have some self-government within the empire for themselves. But the United States during Taylor's time, although it does not militarily support them or anything like that, it does give vocal support for them. During his time in office, Taylor was also responsible for helping to organize the Utah Territory out of the new land acquired in the Mexican Cession of 1848, and he granted Mormons relative independence from Congress. The big problem with the Mormons was that they had moved out to the Utah Territory and established Salt Lake City before the United States had acquired that land. At the time, it was still Mexican territory, but the Mexicans really didn't populate it, and thus it was kind of empty land at the time. Now the United States owns that land, which the Mormons originally had kind of fled from the U.S., and now it just followed them. So the Mormons were concerned that, are we going to be allowed to still practice our religion? Are we still going to be allowed to have our own little bit of self-government out here now that we're officially back in the United States? And Taylor basically agrees and says, I'll let you establish the state of Utah, and at the same time, I will give you relative immunity from Congress, meaning you're not free from all federal laws, but you are free to still practice. Under the First Amendment, you're still free to practice your own religion, and I will make sure that Congress really does nothing to interfere with your own little self-government that you have for your community. He also sees to the major foreign accomplishment that Taylor was able to accomplish during his brief time in office was what we know as the Clayton-Boulder Treaty of 1849, which was between the United States and Great Britain. And what this did was, at the time, the Great Britain and the United States had conflicting claims and interests in Central America, and nations such as Nicaragua and Mexico and Honduras. And because of this, they come in conflict with each other over their Central American aims. Specifically, the United States had the dream of building a canal through Central America to connect the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, which eventually would happen by the early 1900s with the Panama Canal. This idea is already being formulated in the 1840s, and Britain really wanted to build its own canal, but at the same time, each nation wanted to maintain control over it and didn't want it being attacked by the other because they both had interests in Central America. They feared that, for example, if the United States builds a canal in Central America, what will stop Britain from trying to seize it and take control of it? So what happens is they agree for the neutralization of a canal through Central America. That if either nation ends up building a canal through Central America, it will be a neutral canal, that neither one of them is going to see it as a military target. They're not going to try to seize it from another country. It will be free for all nations to use. Now, Taylor's primary concern that he ends up having to deal with during his time in office was the sectional debate over slavery. Now, slavery had been in the United States since its founding. It had not gone anywhere. And as we may recall, in the 1820s, in 1820, under James Monroe, the Missouri Compromise had been made when a dispute ran between the slave and free states over the balance of power in Congress, because they were worried that by admitting Missouri as a slave state, it would give more power to the slave states. So in exchange, Maine was admitted as a free state, and future slave states would not be created above the southern boundary of Missouri. And after that, slavery kind of died down as a sectional issue. It was still there. It didn't completely go away, but it died down a little bit. It didn't take as much national prominence, at least for a good 20 years. Then came the Mexican War. and everything gets blown out of the water. And sadly, the end of the Mexican War, the aftermath, somewhat leads to the Civil War, which we're coming up on within about a 10-year time frame. And it's because of what the Mexican War did. As we recall, the United States wins the Mexican War against Mexico and gains the entire Mexican cession. It gains most of the American West: California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Colorado and Texas. It gains all this new land out west that's also coincidentally south of Missouri's southern border. So technically, under the Missouri Compromise, it's open to slavery. But by this point, the abolition movement in the North has grown so strong that abolitionist Northerners do not want to see slavery expanded in any form, regardless if it would be still in terms of that compromise or not. They basically argue that slavery itself is wrong, it's immoral, it's a sin, and it should not be allowed to expand. It shouldn't even be allowed to exist, let alone expand. And because of this, there is great Northern opposition to the expansion of slavery to the new Western territories. In the South, this angers them. They see slavery as vital to their economy, as vital to their society and their beliefs, and they view that we should have a right to take our slaves with us into these new territories and settle them. It's for our economic benefit. And because of this, there is the growing conflict between the North and South over the issue of slavery. The North really doesn't have a means for it to have slaves anymore. It's becoming more industrialized. There's factories and mills going to work in the North that are allowing for more industrial products to be made. While the South really doesn't industrialize at all. By this time, the South is still an agrarian agricultural economy, and it's very much based on farm work and slavery. It becomes, by this point, by the late 1840s, there's already a stark contrast that's starting to emerge between the North and the South in just their economies and societies alone. Now that argument over slavery is becoming heated again, and this time it's not going to cool down. So you can say that starting in Zachary Taylor's presidency, we are officially on the road to the Civil War, because the argument of slavery that begins after the Mexican-American War will take us up until that point, 10 years later in 1861. We're in 1848 now. Now, basically, that's the whole issue. What happens is the main sectional debate that comes about is California. In 1848, California was already a populous territory somewhat before the United States acquired it. It was somewhat populated. It was more than the rest of the Mexican lands were. But soon after we had acquired it from Mexico, gold is found in California, even though it's a tiny amount, and everyone goes gold crazy. And starting the California gold rush, which we may have learned about before, where there was actually very little gold. It was just everyone was hoping that there was a huge vein or something of it, and they were going to get rich quick. There was never that amount of gold to make anybody that rich. But everyone rushes out to California to try to make their millions for this gold rush that's occurring. There's been gold found. We're going to get rich. Well, this also boosts up California's population dramatically in the span of just 2 years. By 1850, California has reached the population threshold for it to be admitted as a state, and it applies for statehood. However, California poses a problem. The state is both, part of it is south of the Missouri Compromise line, while the other half of it is not. The other half is north of that line. So there comes the question, will slavery be allowed in California? And since it's really the first state to be created out of those new lands acquired from the Mexican War, what would this mean for other territories? Of course, the Northerners are opposed to the creation of new slave states, and ironically, so is President Taylor. Taylor opposes the creation of any new slave states, and this enrages the South. The South gets enraged by his opposition to the creation of new slave states, as part of the reason they had elected him was that he was a slaveholder himself, and they thought that, well, he owns slaves just like we do, we'll have his support and backing if it comes down to a debate in Congress. And Taylor ends up being just the opposite. Because of his nationalism, he views that slavery is a very deathly not definitely, but he views that slavery is a very dangerous issue to be discussing. He sees that it could have the potential to tear the country apart, and he doesn't even want to partake in it. So, for the good of the country, he basically decides that although I own slaves myself, I don't want it to expand because it's morally wrong. This ticks the South off to no end. Taylor ends up wanting the settlers of California and New Mexico to have to skip the territory phase. He wants them to just be admitted as quickly as possible to the Union with state constitutions. They don't, to the point that they don't even have to have a referendum on whether or not slavery would be allowed. This ticks the South off even more. Southerners eventually get so angry by 1850 when California tries to get admitted into the Union, and the Northerners are so opposed to letting slavery exist there. The Southerners start to say that, well, either California is admitted with slavery allowed in it, and slavery better be allowed in these new Western territories, or we're going to secede from the nation because it's no longer serving our interests. Taylor channels this moment where he is like Andrew Jackson. As we recall, Andrew Jackson during his presidency had to deal with a nullification crisis where South Carolina threatened to secede in response to a federal tariff that was upping its cotton prices, compared to the North, which was enjoying relatively low prices on its textiles. It was helping the North but punishing the South, and South Carolina threatened to secede over it. Jackson at the time had said that he would personally hang the governor of South Carolina if South Carolina tried to secede, that he would send troops. Taylor pulls a Jackson in this moment and holds a closed meeting at the White House with many Southern congressional leaders and basically gives them the following warning. As I quote, "Persons taken in rebellion against the Union, I would hang with less reluctance than I had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico." Taylor makes it very clear at this February 1850 meeting that if any state tries to secede, if anyone tries to advocate the states to secede, that he will hang them with no hesitation and with no remorse, that he will hang them faster than he decided to hang people when he was in the Mexican War. Basically saying, don't secede because I not only don't support it, I will punish you for it. So what ends up happening to try to quell this growing divide and debate over the slavery issue is Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky, one of the main priority Whig founders and Whig Party leaders. And by this point, he's getting actually pretty old. I mean, he dies, I think, 1852, 1854. And by this point, this is really the last great compromise. Clay was known as the Great Compromiser during his career because of the many congressional compromises he made between the states on many issues. And this ends up being the last big compromise that Clay kind of constructs. And it's known as the Compromise of 1850. What happens is that it proposes that California be admitted to the Union as a free state without slavery allowed in it. It also, to appease Northerners, says that it will end this trade of slaves in Washington, D.C. Slavery would not be banned in the capital, but it would be the trade of slaves, the selling of them, the market would be shut down in Washington, D.C. But to appease Southerners, the compromise would include a strict new fugitive slave law that would require people in the North or anywhere in the nation to aid in the capture of runaway slaves, which was something the Northerners did not like at all, and the Southerners didn't like that the slave trade was going to be ended in Washington, D.C., and they didn't like that slavery would not be allowed in California. So in reality, it isn't really appeasing either side, but it's an attempt. Taylor declares when the compromise comes out as a proposal, he declares that if the compromise actually passes Congress and reaches his desk, he will veto it if it reaches his desk. He does not support the compromise of 1850. He sees it as dangerous, as inflammatory, and that if it actually reaches my desk, I will not pass it. I will send it back to you with a veto that you'll have to try to override, which I can't guarantee that you would. And this is where that was really Taylor's last big action because unfortunately, he dies. Taylor, during the middle of the crisis of 1850 with this compromise on the table, but not officially passed yet, he dies. What happens is the July 4th holiday comes. Everyone kind of takes a break. Congress goes into recess for the holiday. Taylor takes part in July 4th festivities in Washington, D.C., and on July 4th, he ends up eating raw cherries and milk, iced milk. which were two of his favorite snacks. However, he had been warned to watch what he ate because the previous year a cholera epidemic had torn through Washington, D.C. Cholera is a very deadly disease. It affects the stomach and the digestive system, if I'm not wrong, and it very much killed people back then like nothing. Well, and it's caused by bacteria that can be found in spoiled food. Well, Taylor thought that, oh, I don't care. It's mid-July. It's hot as crap. They're raw cherries. They're not really washed. But I've ate them before. I've not had a problem, so I'm just gonna go ahead and eat them. Well, it killed him because just within a day or two of him doing this, a day or two after the 4th of July, Taylor starts having extremely bad stomach cramps, painful stomach cramps that actually make him hit the floor at times. And eventually it gets worse. And he ends up dying just 5 days later on July 9th. It was later found out that he died of acute gastroenteritis, and this would make him the second president to die in office. He died of a stomach ailment, we'll put it that simply. A stomach ailment is what killed him, probably by eating those raw cherries. So on July 9th, 1850, President Taylor dies in office. He's the second president to die in office, and Vice President Fillmore now becomes the president. And as we're going to see in the next video, he takes an entirely different line of approach to the Compromise of 1850 issue than Taylor had. Now, I do want to show, last two things we have here, just one, I think, actually. Right here is just a small little picture of the lithograph that was published after Taylor's death, a little illustration depicting him on his deathbed. And then, now Taylor received a state funeral and everything that a president would receive nowadays, but I would like to quote from this book. This book is a compilation of Abraham Lincoln's many works. It has many of his letters, many of his addresses, speeches, everything in this book. That you can, if anyone wants a copy, go to Barnes & Noble. They sell this for about $15. I've been like reading through it like nuts, and it's actually quite interesting. It even has the original spellings and everything that Lincoln had for his speeches and all his oratory liveries that he had. But this is very good primary source material if you want to read about Lincoln. But nonetheless, why would I bring this up today? Even though we're not talking about Lincoln, because one of the entries in this book details Lincoln was a congressman at the time of Taylor's death. He had just left Congress, pretty much. He just left his term in the House. This is 1850, and he has a small address that or letter, or whatever you want to call it in here. Try and see what the book calls it. The book calls it as, where is it? It would be either a speech or an address. I'm trying to think here. More of a speech, really. But he has a speech in here on Zachary Taylor's death in 1850. And it's quite interesting to read because Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party, the same party of Taylor at the time. And he kind of delivered his own little speech regarding Taylor's unfortunate death. Don't know if you can actually see that. And this was published on July 25th of 1850, about 2 weeks after Taylor would have died. And on page 43 in here, I noticed just something that Lincoln kind of says about Taylor that I think describes the man well and his relation. Well, not in relation, but what the man's character was. And part of the speech right here, and I quote, in General Taylor's general public relation to his country, what will strongly impress a close observer was his unostentatious, self-sacrificing, long-enduring devotion to his duty. He indulged in no recreations. He visited no public places, seeking applause, but quietly as the earth in its orbit, he was always at his post. Along our whole Indian frontier, through summer and winter, in sunshine and storm, like a sleepless sentinel, he has watched while we have slept for 40 long years. How well might the dying hero say at last, I have done my duty, I am ready to go. In that little paragraph here that Lincoln puts, it sums Taylor's ideal up. Taylor was never a political man, and the only reason he had pursued the presidency was because of the popularity that he had gained from the Mexican War and from his military career beforehand. He was a popular military figure. The people respected him. And when the people wanted him to run in 1848 by popular support, eventually Taylor gave in because he viewed it as the call of duty. That it was my duty to serve the people when they wanted me to serve them. It was my duty to serve in the army when my country needed me. He was an army man till the day he died with his sense of duty. And that was something that Taylor very much, I think, was. It sums him up very well. That he did everything because of what he thought his duty was, be it in his military career or be it running for president. That was what he did during his lifetime. And I just think that those little words here in this book that Abraham Lincoln wrote upon Taylor's death, they very much are a short little summary that sums up the basic ideology of Taylor's actions. That's just something I wanted to put in there. So that does conclude our video on Zachary Taylor, 12th president, second to die in office. Not as short as William Henry Harrison, at least he got a good year out of his presidency. So we will continue this next week with the next 2 presidents at least. We're hoping to maybe do 3. That way we'll be right at Lincoln. So I'm saying by that first week of March, we should be up to Lincoln and be covering him, which is going to be probably a little bit of a longer video just because Lincoln's one of the most famous presidents. He's my personal favorite. He is definitely probably the greatest president I think we've ever had of all 46 of them. He's even a little bit above Washington just because of the crisis he had to deal with and the fact that he had got shot. He became kind of a martyr. But nonetheless, I digress. He's going to be kind of a longer video, so that's why I'm trying to get up to him as soon as possible. But that concludes for today. So next week we'll be back with the next couple of them as we hope to get up to Lincoln here. So as always, like, subscribe, put comments down in the comment section. Any questions or suggestions I'll be happy to answer or take as I see them. I think that pretty much wraps it up. I can't think of much else. Oh, if anyone, I don't know if anyone will, but if anyone in the beleaguered nation or around Europe, around where Butcher Putin has decided to be an absolute dictator, a Hitler, if you will, and invade a peaceful nation of Ukraine, if anyone around there were to happen to see this, which I don't think would happen, but if by chance that were to happen, because I never know, let it be known that I support Ukraine. I think Russia is entirely messed up for doing this. I cannot stress enough, and honestly, I cannot say enough that I believe that sanctions are not enough to rein in this monster, and that the only way to answer a tyrant of this scale that is similar to Hitler is to use force. And at this point, I think that has become more than clear that that might be what needs to be done. But unfortunately, most Western countries don't want to seem to share that sentiment, including my own. So if anyone out there would have happen to chance to see this, let it be known that I do stand with the Ukrainians, and I very much feel sorry for their current situation, and I support them in any way that I could. But I hold sympathy for you if you happen to see this over what is going on over there. I cannot imagine going through what all the destruction and madness that is going on right now over there because of that absolute KGB liar piece of crap. But that concludes this video. So as always, stay safe. Hopefully no one gets sick or anything bad happens, and hopefully everyone stays safe out if you had to go out to Ukraine or something like that. But hopefully everyone remains safe and in good health. So as always, God bless you all.